Okay, so lesson 3, last lesson of the chapter, we're going to be talking about acids and bases today. So what are acids and bases? And when you get to chemistry, you'll realize that it's actually more of a complicated question, or if you do any research yourself online, because there's actually a couple different definitions, and it gets into some math that you haven't quite learned yet. But for now, we're going to kind of simplify it down for you to its simplest definitions. So, firstly, acids and bases, and what are they? Originally, acids and bases were defined based on their properties, and you've learned what chemical and physical properties are. And so they would say, okay, so acids are things that are sour. But that's very vague, right? It's not necessarily concrete because what do you determine to be sour, right? So, a couple things we need to know when defining what acids are. Number one are ions. So, if you've never heard that term before, you may have heard of the term of an atom, right? So an atom is like chemically the smallest particle that still has the substances of what it's made of, right? So if I have hydrogen, a hydrogen atom is going to have all the same properties of hydrogen. Now, an ion is when I take one of those atoms and I either add an electron to it or take an electron away. And again, these are things you'll do more of in chemistry. You're not going to be doing any actual taking or adding of electrons right now, at least. But that's what an ion is. So in an acid, it produces hydrogen ions. That is a positively charged ion, meaning it lost an electron. Bases release hydroxide ions. That's a negatively charged ion, meaning it accepts an electron. So all water solutions contain hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. So water is one of those really special substances. It's super important to understanding chemistry. Its behavior is awesome. The fact that anything can dissociate in it is because it breaks down into these hydrogen and hydroxide ions, which makes bonding very good. So when we get to the bonding chapter, that'll make a lot more sense. Now, solutions, you learned what those were in the last lesson, right? So you have some solute dissolved in a solvent. In an acidic solution, you are going to have more hydrogen ions than hydroxide ions, right? So we know water already breaks down into hydrogen and hydroxide ions, but in an acidic solution, there's going to be more hydrogen. In a basic solution, there's going to be more hydroxide. Now, here are some of those properties of acids and bases, those things that originally were used to define them. So generally, acids taste sour, bases taste bitter, slippery. A lot of soaps are bases. Please don't go around tasting things to figure out if it's an acid or a base. Those are just things that we've determined. So think like citric acid, right? Acids and bases are conductors of electricity. Ions are really good at conducting electricity because electricity is transferred through moving electrons. Acids and bases can be identified by reactions with some metals or nonmetals. So this just has to do with acid and base reactions. So they can go through a bunch of different reactions to see how it reaches equilibrium, and metals, since they're good conductors, are good for that. Acids turn blue litmus paper red, and bases turn red litmus paper blue. This is an acid-base indicator. There are a couple different acid-base indicators, which basically just is something that indicates if it's an acid or a base. Litmus paper is the simplest one. You literally just take a little strip of special paper, dip it in a solution, see what color it turns, and that tells you if it's an acid or a base. There's also certain things like pH paper, which will actually, you dip it in there, it turns one of a varying amount of colors, and it helps you determine what is the actual pH of that solution. And you're going to be doing a virtual lab later this week where you're going to be doing just that. Magnesium and zinc reacts with acids to produce hydrogen gas. That's another property of them. And geologists identify limestone because it produces bubbles of carbon dioxide when exposed to hydrochloric acid. Okay, so you may have also heard the term strong acid or strong base. And what that means is when acids or bases break down in a solution, right? So we'll just use water because we know almost anything can break down in water. If it completely ionizes, meaning it completely breaks apart and releases the maximum amount of those hydrogen ions, then we call it a strong acid. Some acids only slightly dissociate, which is another way of saying breakdown, and we call those weak acids. So it's kind of like a dilute solution. So completely breaks down, it's a strong acid. Partially breaks down, it's a weak acid. So bases follow the same pattern. A strong base is going to completely dissociate and release the maximum amount of hydroxide ions. A weak base will only partially dissociate. So over here, you don't need to record this table in your notes, but this is just an example of some common bases, right? So the first one there is sodium hydroxide. And you see it breaks down into a sodium ion and a hydroxide ion. That's what that OH is, right? If that were to completely break apart and release all the maximum amount of hydroxide ions it can, that would be considered a strong base. So now pH. Again, you may have heard the term pH before, and you may know that that just tells you how acidic or basic something is. How they do that is they actually use it to measure the concentrations, right? So basically how much in a solution of a certain ion that you have. Now, technically they measure something called the hydronium ion, which is H3O plus, but a lot of times they just use a shorthand of hydrogen ions. But basically, it's the same thing. They're both a charge of +1. And what they do is something called a log. You'll learn about a logarithm in Algebra 2, so you don't need to do this math right now, but I'm just introducing you to the equation and how they get the pH value. So they plug in the amount of hydrogen ions that are dissociated. And remember, you know that the more hydrogen ions, meaning if they completely broke down, the stronger the acid. So using that, they find the log of that amount of hydrogen ions, and that gives them a value. That pH value then goes on the table, and they use it to determine if something is more acidic or basic. The scale goes from 0 to 14, the closer to 0. The more acidic, the closer to 14, the more basic, and 7 in the middle is exactly neutral, and that is pure water. And the last thing we'll talk about is POH. So POH is kind of like the sister of pH. Just like they use the logarithm of hydrogen ions to figure out the pH, they use the logarithm of hydroxide ions to figure out the POH. And it's the same idea. It's just, right, so you have a base. You want to figure out how basic it is. You measure the concentration of hydrogen ions that are there. Then once you figure out the log of that, you look at the pH value. Is it closer to 14? Is it closer to 7? Is it closer to 0? And that will tell you how basic something is. So as far as what you need to understand is that POH measures hydroxide ion concentration, pH measures hydrogen ion concentration, and looking at the pH scale, where are the acidic numbers? Where are the basic numbers? Where is neutral? You do not need to understand what a logarithm is. If you do, that's impressive. Awesome. Good job.